Meanwhile, resistance, as I mentioned, to free trade and market-oriented economic strategies is rising in Latin America. The recession has already intensified resistance both in the United States and in Latin America to freer trade. And if the United States is to reap the benefits that will come from a even freer trade regime in the Western Hemisphere, it will have to work to convince citizens throughout Latin America, and indeed in the United States, that free trade is not just a trick concocted by Washington to profit a few at the expense of the many. At present, we have no strategy to do that. The European Union may suggest a solution to this problem. In the EU, the wealthier members like France, Germany, and the United Kingdom have routinely provided billions of dollars every year to Ireland, Portugal, Spain, and the other poorer members for investment in physical infrastructure and in education. These investments have promoted development and made the recipients better trading partners. They have proved to be spectacularly successful. Greece, to the contrary, notwithstanding. The problem with Greece is not that it has didn't benefit from these payments. Thank you very much. From these compensation payments, as they're referred to. The problem with Greece is it's part of a currency union. And what it should have been able to do in order to get out of its current dilemma is to devalue. But since it's in the Eurozone, it can't. So it has to find other means to solve its economic problems, which are not as serious as they would have been had Greece not received over the years compensation payments which generated considerable economic growth. In any case, the United States has increased its funding to the Inter-American Development Bank in recent years, under both Bush and recently under President Obama. But the magnitude of the U.S. commitment is still far too low to be visible to most people in the region. The place to start, perhaps, is Mexico, the country most hit in the Western Hemisphere, that has suffered the most in terms of economic decline as a consequence of the financial and economic crisis in the United States, and on a global scale is one of those economies that has been most devastated by the crisis. The place to start then perhaps is Mexico, where major investments in infrastructure, highways, bridges, border facilities, the rail system, cleaning up the environment, and in human capital, education and health, would not only help Mexico reduce unemployment and promote more trade and investment, but help link freer trade with real improvements in living conditions. U.S. policy toward Mexico will either serve as a model for relations with other Latin American countries, or as a bad example to be avoided. This is one reason why, going to the third of the steps that I mentioned earlier, this is one reason why it is so important to get a sensible and humane immigration policy. The United States admits roughly 150,000 legal immigrants from Mexico each year, and forces the other 300 to 350,000 who don't get documents to cross the U.S. border in desolate and dangerous regions distant from politically sensitive areas of high population density. The U.S. border has become more dangerous than the Berlin Wall. More Mexicans die crossing the U.S. border in 3 months in any given year than died crossing trying to get out of East Germany across the Berlin Wall from the time the wall was constructed until 1961, until it fell nearly 30 years later. Some 500 Mexicans die every year trying to enter the United States. In a U.S. labor force of roughly 145 million, the annual flow of 500,000 Mexican immigrants is tiny, readily absorbed in a growing economy, although difficult to absorb in an economy in recession. But during recessions, the number of Mexicans seeking to come into the United States diminishes. That is to say, Mexican immigration to the United States is counter-cyclical. It tends to disappear or to decline when jobs diminish. One effect of the current immigration policy is to trap Mexicans who are temporarily unemployed in the United States, because it's becoming more costly. The charges of coyotes that you have to pay to help you get across the border have gone up a bit. It's more costly and dangerous and difficult to get into the United States than in the past. So people tend to stay even if they're unemployed, and there's been a reverse flow of remittances in recent months from families in Mexico to their relatives in the United States to allow them to get through this rough patch when they're not employed. The annual flow of 500,000 seems like a large number, but in relation to a labor force of 145 million, it's relatively small, about the amount of job growth in a month or two in a growing economy. With a rapidly aging native-born population, the United States needs immigrants to pay taxes, especially Social Security taxes. So legalizing a larger flow of Mexican labor into the United States could make good economic and fiscal sense. Legalizing the flow of immigration from Mexico and normalizing the status of immigrants already here would benefit the United States and make it much easier, for example, to improve security along the U.S.-Mexican border. Mexican authorities long ago offered to help the United States control its southern border in exchange for an expanded guest worker program for Mexican citizens. Since fences and increased numbers of Border Patrol agents have not proved particularly effective, and the cost of completely militarizing the 2,000 U.S. border with Mexico would be prohibitive, this is probably a deal worth making. To regain control of its southern border, the United States needs not only the willing cooperation of the Mexican government, but that of the multitude of otherwise law-abiding Mexican citizens who cross the border every day, every year. In Mexico, to go on to the fourth step, the cumulative impact of narco-trafficking on Mexican society and institutions has reached alarming proportions. In fact, the gravest threat to the U.S. strategic and economic objectives in the Western Hemisphere, I think, may be the war on drugs, which imposes high costs not only on the United States, but on nearly every country from Mexico south to Bolivia. Colombian society and institutions suffered perhaps more than many others because the cartel wars of the 1980s, precipitated by U.S. demands that Colombia extradite drug traffickers for trial in the United States, undermined the nation's military, police, and justice systems and provoked a spectacular rise in crime and violence. The impact of the prohibition regime on Mexico is compounded by the flow of arms into Mexico from the United States. So far this year, drug traffickers have killed nearly 2,000 people, including hundreds of military, police, public officials, and innocent bystanders. Most of the weapons recovered from drug traffickers in Mexico, about 80%, according to President Calderon's statement just yesterday, originated in the United States and were smuggled across the U.S.-Mexican border. If the United States were to undertake a series of carefully calibrated steps to decriminalize drug sales to adults and adult consumption of drugs, focus law enforcement and prevention on children and adolescents, and develop better treatment programs, it would mark a big step forward in facing an important domestic social problem, as well as in repairing relations with Latin America. It would also make a huge difference to many Latin American governments struggling to contain drug wars and to rescue their criminal justice systems from the massive corruption and breakdowns that have been the main product of the prohibition regime so far. It is difficult to see how countries like Mexico, Colombia, and a dozen more in the Caribbean, as well as Central and South America, can solve these problems so long as the United States outlaws drugs and refuses to outlaw weapons trafficking.